For I'm American. Praise the Lord. I'm American. Praise the Lord. I'm American. Praise the Lord. Praise His holy name.
Welcome back to the Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we congregate at the Blood of the Lamb Gospel Church, Turk Street, off Fillmore, San Francisco, 1929. In this chapter, William witnesses a lively congregation in a black storefront church in San Francisco. He's inspired by their openness and joy as he observes a private cultural moment that nevertheless makes him feel welcome and understood. San Francisco's racial history is not one widely talked about in history books, but it has always been an incredibly diverse city, majorly attracting people from all over the world during the Gold Rush years. Certain neighborhoods in the city were blocked off for immigrants and for non-white people, like pretty much every American city. Specifically, the Western Addition was a neighborhood that housed most of the non-white and immigrant populations before and after the 1906 earthquake. This is where Saroyan lived in 1929 on Sutter Street. The largest ethnic groups living in the neighborhood were Filipinos, Japanese, African Americans, Mexicans, and Eastern European Jews. Before the earthquake, black San Franciscans were largely living on the edges of Chinatown and south of Market. Throughout the 20th century, housing covenants disallowed non-whites to live in many parts of the city, so the black population had largely moved to Oakland after the earthquake, where there was more land, single-family housing, and no similar restrictions on who could own land. Oakland is where the middle-class black community could thrive, and where more black people could reach the middle class, being allowed to enter into professions like healthcare and business, simply due to the fact that the black community was large enough to require these services of each other. In San Francisco, the black community remained relatively small and mostly poor, serving overwhelmingly as household staff until the World Wars opened up more manufacturing jobs. By 1930, 78% of the San Francisco black community lived in the Western Addition. After World War II, this enclave would be called the Fillmore, where the community thrived for a time. The first black churches appeared in San Francisco in the 1850s as the AME, or African Methodist Episcopal churches. These typically attracted congregants originally from the northeast of the country. The Third Baptist Church was also founded in the 1850s and appealed to migrants from the South. These churches were community spaces, and by the 1920s had also developed systems that helped protect the black community from civil and economic injustices. However, many migrants longed for the intimate, one-room churches of the rural South, and so rented space in empty storefronts to recreate these spiritual places. This is the historical context for Saroyan's visit to the Blood of the Lamb Gospel Church. The so-called storefront churches that he describes were much more popular in the Midwest cities like Detroit and Chicago, where the Great Migration, starting in 1916, moved black people from the Deep South to the North, Midwest, and West. Evidence of this particular church, the Blood of the Lamb, is hard to come by. Saroyan may have recreated the name from memory and from the feeling it originally invoked. He does mention that many of the gospel songs he heard there involved being washed in the blood of the Lamb, so this may just be a general name he associated with the church. Or maybe it was a joke on lamb being both a religious symbol and a staple of the Armenian diet. The black population and accordingly storefront churches proliferated after World War II, so it would be interesting if this story was misplaced in time and is actually a combination of the wanderings near Sutter Street and later wanderings in the Sunset District. Saroyan was living on Sutter Street in 1929, and he tells us he was fresh off of his failure in New York when he was looking for free diversions by walking around the city. Typically, he used libraries, museums, galleries, department stores, and churches to entertain him. A 15-minute walk from home, he tells us, found him at the Blood of the Lamb Gospel Church. When he got to the church, he sat in the back row and observed. It was a church founded by several black people, and one frequently heard grateful references to Brother Hutchins, Elder Montgomery, gospel singer Sister Ellison, and Sexton Graves. There was no preacher as such, or rather there was no official or ordained minister, but everybody seemed to be equal to either a testimonial about his life and transformation, a reading with asides from the good book, a loud prayer, a very lively dance, or a recitation in tongues. The speaking in tongues suggests this may have been a Pentecostal church. The modern Pentecostal movement is rooted in 1906 in Los Angeles, where a church was founded by William J. Seymour, the son of freed slaves. The Azusa Street Revival, as his movement was called, lasted until 1915 and is credited with being the primary catalyst for American Pentecostalism in the 20th century. The church Saroyan attended may have been inspired by this revival, as travel up and down California was common by the 1920s. It was the speaking in tongues that attracted Saroyan back. What sounded vaguely like Spanish to Saroyan was instead a collection of rootless words, spoken with eyes shut, standing, and with a type of sweaty possession that Saroyan calls the language of the angels. This was interesting to young Saroyan, whose work at that time was especially focused on rhythm. The people of the congregation were overwhelmed with emotion, and the speakers of tongues had energy that rose and fell with rather intelligent gibberish. And here Saroyan attempts to recreate some of the words from memory, having a distinctly Latin feeling to them. He concludes this chapter by saying that his favorite part was the gospel singing, and in particular the lyrics, "There was power in the powerhouse," which he loved because of its proud and loud happiness. And this may be referring to the gospel song, "Power in the House," heard here. Saroyan was a student of the streets, eschewing traditional education in favor of experience. He was always curious and bold, fitting in with all types throughout his life. A strong message of his early 1930s writings was that there's a greater equality among the poor because so many different ethnicities have been forced to live among each other in tenements. His stories in the 1930s especially feature the people of the Western Addition, the Mexicans, Filipinos, African Americans, and the smattering of other immigrants like his family. The sense of joy and inclusion at this church may have appealed to him at that time, when he was rootless and feeling nervous about his writing future and his family's doubt about it, and separated from his community in Fresno that was the first to make him feel like he belonged somewhere. And here was a warm community coming together on a chilly San Francisco street, even if it wasn't his own. Though Saroyan is known for the stories of his Armenian youth, in Fresno he lived in a poor neighborhood with diverse immigrant neighbors. Writing about the equality of man wasn't exactly blockbuster material in those years, but he tried it anyway, and it was received well. This chapter was probably based on a real experience, though its details may be cobbled together from various sources. What we can gather from it is that Saroyan appreciated the culture of the church and found that it aligned with his own feelings of joyful spiritualism, as he rejected the formal church more and more. And by keeping himself open to new experiences, he explains how he was inspired by the rhythms of this church. In one example of a very stylized and rhythmic story, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, in the Daring Young Man collection, the protagonist collects records for his phonograph. In the music he finds the noblest weeping or laughter of mortality, as his job at a teletype machine slowly threatens to mechanize his soul. Through his phonograph, he could listen to any music he liked. He had Romanian folk songs, Negro spirituals, American westerns, American jazz, Grieg, Beethoven, Gershwin. And then this teletype machine takes on the rhythms of music as he begins communicating with another teletype operator remotely through their machines. He visualizes his life with this other operator, a young woman, and the rhythms of their life come as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, same as the teletype machine. This marks a time in his life when he was experimenting with form and expression, and matches closely to the musical shapes he was doodling on his scrap paper. was a very rich, lively time of Saroyan's writing. In the early 1930s, Saroyan did still attend a Presbyterian church, the denomination of his preacher father. This journal entry makes it seem uneventful and dry, however. In the story Big Valley Vineyard and the Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, he writes, "It's distressing to try to be a Christian when the name enjoys such capitalistic disgrace, when the greatest Christian church is so fat, so purely ornamental, and so statistical about the soul." He was of course writing this as anti-capitalism was gaining momentum, but before it was totally vilified as Soviet-style fascism. It was also in the 1930s that he was concerned with the transcendence of mankind past borders, race, and languages. So the speaking in tongues also fed into this concept of moving past language into a oneness. It's a joyful chapter, a bit of fish out of water, but ultimately celebrating the diversity of the human experience. By the 1930s, Saroyan was in a unique position as part of a group that was discriminated against, but that ultimately was able to achieve middle-class status faster than their darker-complected neighbors. In this way, he could report the stories of the silenced as someone who was once one of them, but also increasingly becoming accepted by the elite. Saroyan eventually existed in two socioeconomic classes at once, and this is also what might have kept his multi-ethnic stories under the radar. And of course, America has always loved a story of a successful man having pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. This chapter illustrates the many influences he had simply because he was poor and curious, but living an authentic, uncurated life. And the committed reader can look at his earliest stories and search for the influence of Black spirituals and old-time religion in his rhythms. That's what makes Places Where I've Done Time similar to a behind-the-scenes documentary of his career, providing a guided tour of his life's work that you can read side by side. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.